Welcome to Wellness with John, resources to help you thrive. I'm John Peters, and in this video, I'm going to talk about healthy versus toxic whining and complaining because whining and complaining is something you do, I do, everybody does, but there is a difference between it being healthy for you and it being toxic. So stay tuned. Okay, so I thought I'd make a video about whining and complaining because it's something that everybody does. And as a therapist, it's something that people actually kind of fall into two camps around. There is the camp of people who are very self conscious about it and confused about whether they should be doing it at all or in therapy. And they'll be whining about something, maybe even briefly in the therapy session. And then they continually apologize. I'm sorry that I'm whining so much. I'm sorry I'm complaining so much. Okay. And this represents a confusion about whether whining and complaining is healthy at all, which I'm going to explain in this video. But the other camp of people is people who just don't even aren't self-conscious about it at all. And even some people see therapy as an opportunity to hire someone just so they can whine and complain the whole time, right? Which, as you can see how I'm saying that, I don't agree with, right? So what is healthy whining and complaining versus unhealthy or unproductive or even toxic whining and complaining? This is what we're going to talk about today. Okay. So by whining and complaining, I mean that we are giving voice either inside our head to ourself or to another person, some description of our misery, right? So let's say I have a headache and I talk to you and I say, "Oh man, I don't feel good today. I'm really having trouble focusing on my work because my head is just pounding and hurting, and I hate having this headache, right? So putting voice to some aspect of our subjective experience of misery, right? And I think that we should not try to dial that to zero. Although by the end of the video, I'm going to give you some tips and some things to experiment with. And I do think that it is worth experimenting with trying to dial it to zero just to become more aware of how you're relating to your whining and complaining. But I'll get to that later. So stay tuned to the end to get that. But, I think that some whining and complaining is actually productive when trying to dial it to zero is not giving voice to something that we need to kind of let out in order to move on, right? So part of being healthy is having a fluid relationship with whatever we're dealing with. And that includes dealing with challenges. And so I actually encourage my patients and my friends and myself to, at times, give themselves permission to throw a little tantrum about something because inside us, we do have a will to throw tantrums. We have a will to complain, a will to whine. And if we try to act like a saint and stuff that urge, it may pop up anyway. And I'll give you an example of that I see with my patients who are going through prolonged chronic stress and also patients who are going through prolonged grief processes. Often there are miserable aspects of chronic conditions like grief and chronic stress of different types. And when people, reasonably try to steer their focus out of whining and complaining, maybe for good reasons, sometimes it pops up anyway, right? And a common place that it pops up is in bad dreams and nightmares, right? Trouble sleeping. And I think that to me is part of the evidence of this idea that sometimes an issue that is unresolved and is miserable for us, it has some sort of mental energy and it's going to pop up if we try to suppress it too much. And this is the logic of why I sometimes recommend that people allow themselves a brief time to throw a tantrum. Because I think if you constrain it and make it brief, You can allow yourself to go there, but you can do that in a healthy way that lets that energy out so it doesn't pop up, let's say, as a nightmare, but you don't get stuck in it, right? So for me, healthy whining and complaining, whether inside our own head or out of our mouth to another person or out loud by ourselves, maybe, healthy whining and complaining is where we allow ourselves to just open up and express some aspect of our misery, but we don't get stuck in it. Okay, so healthy complaining is complaining that we don't get stuck in. We can then move on. All right. Number two, whining and complaining isn't our only strategy, right? Because, and I'll explain that when I talk about it being toxic here in a minute. So it is one of many strategies. We're just choosing in some moment to whine and complain for a brief amount of time and not get stuck in it. And also that it doesn't too strongly reaffirm our ego, our identity as a victim, because victimhood, when we reinforce our sense of ourself as a victim, we reinforce our lack of power and our lack of control. And that's subjectively miserable. It increases our stress and it lowers our effective coping with whatever the complex challenges are that we're dealing with in our life, right? And then the last thing is that it doesn't frighten or hurt other people or toxify a relationship, okay? So let me turn all of that upside down and say that if we don't pay attention to those elements, that whining and complaining can be toxic, right? So, for example, if a patient of mine hires me as a therapist or a coach and they want to just spend all their time whining and complaining, and that's all they're doing, um, I think that's unethical for me to hire myself out to sit and do that. Maybe some people are willing to do that, and maybe a lot of therapists do that, but I don't think that's effective because those sessions might violate those rules that I just described. They might not look for actual proactive, effective kind of coping and increase the capacity of the person to cope with their challenges. And they might, strongly reaffirm the person's sense of victimhood, which is actually not good for them on many levels, including the deep core sense of self level. And so we need to be able to put it in its place, meaning whining and complaining as one possible thing that we do. And the easiest way is to just, as long as we're not violating those rules, allow ourselves to have a moment here or there to just throw a little tantrum about something, right? And again, a little tantrum is one that doesn't toxify us or our relationships with other people, right? Now, here are some examples of toxic whining and complaining that needs to be modified. Over the years, I've worked a lot with divorcing parents. It's the kind of population that I work with sometimes. And one of the things I've noticed is that when people separate after a marriage that became more and more problematic, and then they've got lots of conflict at the time of separation, and if they're co-parenting after separation, they've got all sorts of challenges and conflicts, and the toxicity of whatever went on in the marriage is coming along with them. What I have found is a common issue that comes up is people enter into a new relationship with a new partner. And they do this during the phase that they're still quite angry and feeling victimized by their ex, who they think is evil, stupid, and crazy. And then what they do is they form this new relationship while in a state of not being able to unhook from whining and complaining about how evil and stupid and crazy their ex is, right? You may know somebody like this in your life, right? They're going through a breakup and they can't stop complaining about the breakup all day, every day. And so, they enter in this new relationship, and their new partner then is in a partnership with a person who basically all day, every day is whining and complaining about how evil, stupid, and crazy their ex is. Um, that doesn't look like a real satisfying type of relationship for people to have. But I see this sustained, people lock themselves into that mode for months and for some people years. But to me, that is toxic whining and complaining on multiple levels because, in that example, it toxifies the relationship because if they have kids with their ex, part of what they're doing is they're toxifying the new partner's attitude toward their ex, which is going to toxify the relationship of the new partner with their kids from their former relationship, right? There's no way around that. And do you want to enter into a partnership with a new partner who's going to have a toxic relationship with your children? No. With you? No. With the world? No. But you're doing that by unrestrained, toxic whining and complaining in that type of situation, right? So, to circle back around and differentiate healthy versus toxic whining and complaining, healthy whining and complaining is going to be brief. It's going to be fluid in that you can then unhook and move on after throwing your little tantrum. Your whining and complaining is not going to unduly burden you with the identity of being out of control and being a victim, even though you're temporarily kind of voicing that concern. And it's not going to frighten or hurt someone else or toxify a relationship with a partner, a family member, a child, your therapist. Those to me are the ways that those are the elements of the evaluation that I use to differentiate healthy whining and complaining from toxic. And so that's why when a patient of mine, and it's a very frequent thing, people do this all the time. When a patient of mine says, "Oh, I'm sorry about whining and complaining," I often just take a moment and help them see the difference between healthy whining and complaining and toxic whining and complaining, because I actually want whining and complaining to be one of the tools in my toolbox. I want it to be one of the tools in my clients' toolboxes because it has its place, right? It can feel relieving to spend a moment whining and complaining. A long-term friend of mine once helped him with this because he has the same attitude about this stuff that I do. And years ago, I was having this really horrible, horrible moment on a horrible day, going through some chronic stress. So I called my friend up because we talk regularly, and I said, "Hey, can I whine and complain about such and such?" And my friend responded and said, "Sure, go ahead. You've got 2 minutes," right? So my friend was supporting this idea that it's fine, maybe even desirable and healthy, but we're going to limit it, right? That's not all of what we're going to do. Okay, that's my attitude toward whining and complaining. Now, let me pause here for a second and say that this video is not sponsored by anybody but me. And one of the things that I do in my business is I offer coaching. I offer resources for people to help them thrive. And one thing I wanted to just mention that you might want to access is I offer a stress management free ebook that is a short, concise description of some easy to learn, easy to practice stress management techniques that are extremely reliable to lower your stress and anxiety. And if you'd like to get a free copy of that, just go to courses.johnpeters.online/free stress ebook. I'll put the link down in the description below if you want to check that out. And you can feel free to browse my private practice site too to get an understanding of the range of things that I do in my practice. And I also recommend that you browse other videos on this channel if you're finding this one enlivening. I also highly recommend that you like this video if you like this kind of content, and that you subscribe to my channel to be apprised of future uploads that I'm going to continue to do. And I always welcome comments because it helps me learn how people are taking in the videos and gives me ideas for future content. Okay. So to move on just a little bit and talk about the practice of working with the part of yourself that whines and complains. Okay. If you want to think about how to make your whining and complaining more healthy, number one, that first element that I mentioned is you need to be able to allow yourself to whine and complain in a healthy way, but then to limit it. And you also need to pay attention to not reaffirming your identity as a victim and being out of control. This is an important aspect of whining and complaining. And one of the ways that we work with whining and complaining is to try to let the person have a certain amount of diffusion. And I made a whole series on acceptance and commitment therapy recently. And in the second of the 7-part series, I talked about cognitive diffusion. And I'll put a link up here now if you want to check out that episode. But cognitive diffusion is where we are basically one step removed from something, even though we're still focused on it. So, one way to take care of not being too much of a victim when you're whining and complaining is to use the techniques of cognitive diffusion. And if you can't do this on your own, hiring a therapist who works with cognitive therapy is one way to get support in doing this. But let me give you an example of how to diffuse cognitively an element in a session of whining and complaining. So let's say that I think my ex is evil, stupid, and crazy, and so I think, oh man, she's got all the power here, and she's doing this stuff, and it sucks. I hate when she does that, and this is awful for me. Okay, so that's a very subjective, fused kind of representation of some moment where some challenging conflict is happening between me and my ex, right? If I say to myself, I don't like this, in this moment, I am finding this challenging, okay? I don't really like having to experience these times where she does things that then confuse me about what I can even do about it, okay? So I'm turning the focus from she is this, the situation is this, to here's what I'm thinking about it. And here's what I don't like about it. And I'm acknowledging that with some elements of that moment, I don't know what to do about it, and I kind of feel out of control about it. But if we frame it as an isolated thing, like I don't know what to do about that particular thing there, that's different than this sucks and this is ruining my life. Okay. We globalize misery out like that, and then we feel victimized, we feel loss of power, we feel loss of agency, loss of the ability to be in control. And that is a fused state. So diffusion is where we get at least one step removed and we isolate the element that's causing us the misery in a way that it doesn't spread out into our whole universe and clobber us more than it actually needs to, right? Because we want the whining and complaining to be relieving of that energy that the substance of the situation has, but we don't want it to toxify us. And unfortunately, toxic whining and complaining actually can damage a person. Not only is it unproductive, but it can damage you, right? So here's an exercise that you can actually try that can sometimes bring to light new insights about how you are whining and complaining in more toxic ways. And that is to take a day, let's say tomorrow, you decide that from the minute you wake up to the minute you go to sleep, you are actually not going to open your mouth and whine or complain at all. So I mentioned earlier that in general, I don't want us all to try to dial it to zero all of the time. But as an experiment, it's an interesting experiment to see how much you whine and complain to other people in your life if you take one day and just say, for today, this very day, from the minute I wake up till I go to sleep tonight, I'm not going to whine or complain about anything, right? If it goes on in my head, I'll keep my mouth shut and not speak it out loud just for one day, okay? It's often very instructive to pay attention to then what goes on in your head when you're resisting that urge to whine and complain out loud for that day, right? I challenge you to do that experiment, okay? And if you want to take it to the hero mode, another experiment is take a day and do a similar thing, but on that day, not only are you going to agree to not whine and complain out loud to any other person for the whole day, but you are not going to whine or complain inside your own head to yourself for a whole day, right? So from the minute you wake up to the minute you go to sleep for an entire day, you're not going to whine and complain out loud or even inside your head. And if you find it popping up in your head, you're just going to shut it down and say, okay, I'm going to move on and do something else. I am not going to whine and complain today. Okay. Now, again, I am not prescribing that as a global life policy because, as I said, I think whining and complaining has a place in a healthy repertoire of things that we do when it is one of many tools in our toolbox, but not the only tool, right? But I think that some of the time we want to whine and complain about things, and that's absolutely fine. In fact, if you try to make it zero, it'll pop back up anyway. So we need to address it to some degree. And sometimes that's just by letting it out a little bit. But by not doing it in a way that makes us a victim, makes us powerless, or toxifies our identity or our relationships with any other person, right? So I hope this was helpful. And if you like this kind of content, as I said, like the video and come back and see me in future videos. And I will see you soon.